Abraham Lincoln was born on February 12, 1809, in a small log cabin in Hardin County, Kentucky. The world he entered was rough, quiet, and demanding. There were no paved roads, no comfort of cities, and no guarantee of opportunity. His family lived off the land, and survival often depended on the strength of one's hands and the endurance of one's spirit. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hardworking but modest farmer and carpenter. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, was known for her kindness and gentle nature. From her, young Abraham absorbed his first sense of compassion and moral awareness. But tragedy struck early. When Abraham was just 9 years old, his mother died from what was called milk sickness, a disease caused by contaminated milk. Her death left a deep wound in his heart that never fully healed. Years later, he would say that losing his mother was the saddest event of his life. Soon after, Thomas Lincoln remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, a warm and supportive stepmother. She recognized Abraham's intelligence early and encouraged him to read and learn. Unlike many frontier children, Abraham had very little formal schooling, less than a year in total. But he developed a hunger for knowledge that no lack of teachers could stop. Books became his closest companions. He would walk miles just to borrow a single book. Among his early favorites were the Bible, Robinson Crusoe, Pilgrim's Progress, and Aesop's Fables. He read them by firelight, sometimes even by the dim glow of a burning log after the fire had died down. Every word he read shaped his thinking and expanded his imagination beyond the limits of his small world. Life on the frontier was physically exhausting. Abraham worked clearing land, splitting logs, and helping his father build fences. He became exceptionally strong and tall, eventually reaching about 6 feet 4 inches, towering over most men of his time. Yet despite his strength, he was known for being gentle and thoughtful rather than aggressive. Even as a teenager, Lincoln began to stand out in small but meaningful ways. He was known for his honesty, a trait that would later define his entire legacy. Once, while working in a general store, he accidentally overcharged a customer by a small amount. Realizing the mistake, he walked several miles after work just to return the extra coins. This act earned him the nickname Honest Abe, a name that would follow him for life. But his early years were not just about character building. They were also filled with movement and instability. The Lincoln family moved several times, eventually settling in Indiana when Abraham was around 7 years old. The land there was even wilder and the work even harder. Still, it was in Indiana that Abraham began to truly grow into himself. One of the most important developments during this period was his growing curiosity about justice and fairness. He lived in a time when slavery was legal in many parts of America, and even though Indiana was a free state, he witnessed the contradictions of a nation that spoke of liberty while allowing human bondage. He once saw a group of enslaved people being transported along the river and was deeply disturbed by the sight. That moment, though simple and brief, planted a seed of moral questioning in his mind that would later shape the destiny of a nation. Tragedy struck again when Abraham was only 19 years old. His beloved older sister, Sarah, died during childbirth. This loss hit him deeply, leaving him more withdrawn and reflective. Around the same time, he began to separate more from his father, seeking his own path in life. He no longer wanted to remain tied only to farm labor. His mind was reaching toward something greater, though he did not yet know what that was. In 1830, the Lincoln family moved once again, this time to Illinois. Abraham, now a young man, chose to strike out on his own. He helped guide a flatboat down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. This journey would prove life-changing. In New Orleans, he witnessed slavery firsthand in its harshest form, human beings being sold at auction, families separated, people treated as property rather than human lives. This experience left a permanent impression on him. He later described it as one of the most powerful and disturbing moments of his life. After returning from the trip, Lincoln settled in New Salem, Illinois. It was here that he began to transition from laborer to thinker, from worker to leader. He took on various jobs, store clerk, postmaster, and surveyor. But more importantly, he began to study law on his own. He borrowed legal books and read them intensely, teaching himself the principles of justice and governance. People in New Salem began to notice his intelligence, storytelling ability, and natural leadership. He was tall, slightly awkward, but deeply thoughtful and humorous. He had a way of speaking that made even complex ideas easy to understand. Slowly, he began to gain respect in the community. It was also during this time that Lincoln made his first attempt at public office. In 1832, he ran for the Illinois state legislature. He did not win, but the experience taught him valuable lessons about politics and human connection. Instead of giving up, he remained determined. He would later say that failure was not defeat but preparation. As the years passed in New Salem, Lincoln's character continued to form through hardship, observation, and relentless self-education. He had not yet become the towering political figure history remembers, but the foundation was already being built through loss, struggle, reading, and moral reflection. The boy from the log cabin was slowly becoming a man of ideas, and the nation had not yet realized that this quiet, self-taught young man would one day hold it together in its darkest hour. After his early years of hardship and self-education, Abraham Lincoln entered a new phase of life in Illinois that would transform him from a drifting young man into a rising public figure. The world of New Salem had given him confidence, but it was in law and politics that his identity truly began to take shape. By the mid-1830s, Lincoln was no longer just a laborer or store clerk. He had developed a reputation in his community as someone who could think clearly, speak persuasively, and solve disputes fairly. His natural storytelling ability made him popular, but it was his sense of justice that made people trust him. In a frontier society where formal education was rare, Lincoln's self-taught mind stood out like a lantern in the dark. He decided to study law seriously. Unlike modern legal students, Lincoln had no university, no formal instructors, and no structured curriculum. Instead, he borrowed law books whenever he could, often reading them late into the night by candlelight. He studied Blackstone's commentaries and other foundational texts, slowly teaching himself the structure of American law. His method was simple but powerful: read, understand, and apply. By 1836, Lincoln was licensed to practice law in Illinois. Soon after, he moved to Springfield, the state capital, where opportunities were greater. Springfield was a growing town filled with ambition, political debate, and legal disputes. It was the perfect place for Lincoln to grow. As a lawyer, Lincoln traveled the 8th Judicial Circuit, covering vast stretches of Illinois on horseback. He would go from town to town, representing clients in courthouses that were often little more than wooden buildings. The work was exhausting: long journeys, unpredictable weather, and endless cases, but Lincoln embraced it. He became known for his fairness, honesty, and ability to simplify complex arguments. Unlike many lawyers of his time, Lincoln was not interested in trickery or manipulation. He preferred clarity and truth. If he believed his client was wrong, he sometimes advised settlement rather than proceeding in court. This unusual honesty made him respected, even by his opponents. One of the most famous moments from his early legal career involved a murder case where he defended a man accused of killing in self-defense. During the trial, Lincoln used a detailed almanac to prove that the moonlight on the night of the incident was too dim for a witness to have clearly seen the event. The case was dismissed, and Lincoln's reputation as a brilliant, logical lawyer grew rapidly. While his legal career flourished, Lincoln also entered the world of politics more seriously. He was elected to the Illinois state legislature in 1834 and again in later terms. In the legislature, he aligned himself with the Whig Party, which supported economic development, infrastructure, and modernization. Lincoln believed that progress came through opportunity and education rather than inherited privilege. Even as a young politician, Lincoln stood out for his careful thinking. He rarely spoke impulsively. Instead, he studied issues deeply before forming an opinion. His colleagues noticed that when Lincoln spoke, people listened, not because he was loud, but because he was logical. During this time, Lincoln also experienced personal loss and emotional struggle. In 1835, he became deeply attached to a young woman named Anne Rutledge. Their relationship is often described as one of his first great emotional bonds. When she died suddenly in 1835, Lincoln fell into a period of deep grief. Friends reported that he became withdrawn and melancholic, questioning the meaning of happiness and loss. This emotional depth, though painful, would later shape his empathy as a leader. After recovering from this period of sorrow, Lincoln returned to public life with renewed determination. In 1842, he married Mary Todd, a well-educated and ambitious woman from a prominent Kentucky family. Mary Todd Lincoln, their marriage was passionate but often turbulent, marked by both affection and tension. Mary pushed Abraham toward higher political ambition, believing in his potential for national leadership even when he doubted himself. As the 1840s progressed, Lincoln's political experience deepened. He served a single term in the U.S. House of Representatives from 1847 to 1849. While in Congress, he was not a dominant figure, but he observed national politics closely. One of his most important moments during this period was his opposition to the Mexican-American War. He questioned its justification, introducing what became known as the spot resolutions, demanding clarity on where American blood had been shed. This stance was controversial and cost him political popularity at home, but it demonstrated his willingness to challenge authority when he believed it was wrong. After his term in Congress, Lincoln faced a setback. He returned to Springfield and largely stepped away from national politics. Many assumed his political career was over. Instead, he focused on rebuilding his law practice, which became one of the most successful in Illinois. He partnered with William Herndon, and together they handled numerous cases that strengthened Lincoln's financial stability and reputation. Yet beneath his professional success, Lincoln continued to reflect deeply on the issue of slavery, which was becoming more divisive across the United States. He believed slavery was morally wrong, but he also struggled with how and when it should be addressed politically. He was not yet calling for immediate abolition, but he was moving steadily toward a stronger moral stance against it. The 1850s brought increasing national tension. Laws like the Kansas-Nebraska Act reopened the debate over whether new territories should allow slavery. Lincoln re-entered politics with renewed energy, delivering speeches that criticized the expansion of slavery, while appealing to logic, law, and morality rather than emotion alone. In 1858, Lincoln entered one of the most important political contests of his life, the Illinois Senate race against Stephen A. Douglas. The Lincoln-Douglas debates became legendary. Across Illinois, the two men argued about slavery, democracy, and the future of the nation. Douglas defended popular sovereignty, the idea that territories should decide slavery for themselves. Lincoln argued that slavery was morally wrong and should not expand further. Though Lincoln lost the Senate race, the debates made him a national figure. His arguments were widely published and read across the country, increasing his political influence dramatically. By the end of the 1850s, Abraham Lincoln was no longer a local lawyer or unknown politician. He was a national voice in a deeply divided country. His journey from log cabin to courtroom to political stage had shaped him into a man prepared for something much greater than even he fully understood. The stage of American history was changing, and Lincoln was moving closer to its center. By the late 1850s, Abraham Lincoln had risen from relative obscurity to national recognition. His debates with Stephen A. Douglas had made his name known across the United States, and his calm, logical stance against the expansion of slavery resonated with many in the North. What he did not yet fully realize was that he was about to step into the most difficult role in American history, at the most dangerous time. The election of 1860, a turning point in 1860, the newly formed Republican Party gathered to choose its candidate for president. Lincoln was not the most famous contender. Many expected more experienced politicians to take the nomination. But Lincoln had something unique. He was seen as moderate, honest, and capable of uniting different factions within the party. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, something remarkable happened. After several rounds of voting, Lincoln emerged as the chosen candidate. His supporters celebrated, but across the nation, especially in the southern states, fear began to spread. Lincoln's position against the expansion of slavery alarmed many Southern leaders. They believed his presidency would threaten their way of life and economic system. Even before the election results were finalized, talk of secession had begun. When Lincoln won the election in November 1860, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several Southern states declared that they would leave the Union rather than accept his leadership. They formed a new government called the Confederate States of America. For Lincoln, this was not the victory he had imagined. Instead of leading a united nation, he was stepping into a crisis that threatened to tear the country apart. The road to war before Lincoln even took office, the Union was already breaking. By the time he was inaugurated in March 1861, 7 states had seceded. The question facing him was enormous. Should he allow the country to divide or should he fight to preserve it? In his inaugural address, Lincoln chose his words carefully. He did not threaten the South, but he made one thing clear: the Union must be preserved. He believed that the United States was not just a collection of states, but a single nation that could not simply be broken apart. Soon after, tensions reached a breaking point at Battle of Fort Sumter. Confederate forces fired on a Union fort in South Carolina, forcing its surrender. This attack marked the official beginning of the American Civil War. Lincoln responded by calling for troops to defend the Union. This decision pushed more Southern states to join the Confederacy. What had once been a political conflict had now become a full-scale war. A leader under pressure, Lincoln's early days as president were filled with uncertainty. He had little military experience, and many doubted his ability to lead during a war. Critics described him as inexperienced, awkward, and unprepared. Some even believed the Union would quickly lose under his leadership. But Lincoln possessed something more important than experience. He had resilience, patience, and a deep moral conviction. He worked tirelessly, often late into the night, reading reports, meeting generals, and making difficult decisions. He visited soldiers, listened to advisors, and constantly learned from mistakes. Unlike many leaders, Lincoln was willing to admit when he was wrong and change course when necessary. One of his greatest challenges was finding capable military commanders. Early Union generals struggled, leading to frustrating defeats. Lincoln replaced them one by one, searching for someone who could lead effectively. This process was painful and politically risky, but Lincoln refused to settle for mediocrity. The weight of war, the Civil War, was unlike anything the United States had ever experienced. It was brutal, bloody, and deeply personal. Families were divided, brothers fought against brothers, and entire communities were torn apart. Lincoln felt the weight of every loss. He regularly visited hospitals to comfort wounded soldiers and wrote letters to grieving families. These moments revealed a deeply human side of the president. He was not distant from the suffering, he carried it with him. At the same time, Lincoln faced intense political pressure. Some demanded that he end slavery immediately. Others warned that doing so would push border states to join the Confederacy. Lincoln had to balance moral conviction with political reality. He understood that preserving the Union was his primary duty, but he also believed that slavery was fundamentally wrong. The challenge was deciding how and when to act. The emancipation decision begins as the war continued. Lincoln began to see that slavery was not just a moral issue. It was also central to the conflict itself. The Confederacy depended on enslaved labor to support its economy and war effort. Weakening slavery could weaken the rebellion. This realization led Lincoln toward one of the most important decisions of his life. In 1862, after months of careful thought, he drafted a preliminary version of what would become the Emancipation Proclamation. This document would declare that enslaved people in Confederate territories were to be set free. However, Lincoln knew the timing had to be right. Issuing such a proclamation during a period of Union defeat might make it seem like an act of desperation. He decided to wait for a military victory. That opportunity came after the Battle of Antietam in September 1862. Though not a decisive victory, it gave Lincoln the moment he needed. Soon after, he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. A new meaning for the war. On January 1, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation officially took effect. It transformed the Civil War from a fight solely to preserve the Union into a fight for human freedom. The decision was controversial. Some supported it passionately, while others opposed it strongly. But Lincoln stood firm. He believed that history would judge this moment, and he chose to stand on the side of justice. The proclamation also allowed African American men to join the Union Army, adding strength and new purpose to the fight. Thousands stepped forward, fighting not just for the Union but for their own freedom. Lincoln's growing strength. By this point, Lincoln had changed. The hesitant, inexperienced president of 1861 had become a determined wartime leader. He had faced criticism, defeat, and unimaginable pressure, but he had not broken. Instead, he had grown stronger, wiser, and more resolute. He once said, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." This humility, combined with his determination, made him a unique leader, one shaped by circumstances yet never controlled by fear. As the war continued, the stakes grew even higher. The Union had to win, not just for political unity but for the future of freedom itself. And Lincoln knew that the hardest moments were still ahead. As the long and devastating Civil War drew closer to its end, Abraham Lincoln stood at the height of his leadership. The years of struggle, doubt, and sacrifice had transformed him into a symbol of resilience and moral clarity. Yet even in these final moments of victory, Lincoln's thoughts were not of celebration, but of healing. The war nears its end. By 1864 and early 1865, the tide had clearly turned in favor of the Union. Under the command of General Ulysses S. Grant, Union forces began to press the Confederacy from multiple directions. The strategy was relentless: apply constant pressure until the Confederate Army could no longer continue. Cities fell, supply lines collapsed, and Confederate resistance weakened. One of the final and most decisive moments came with the fall of Richmond, the Confederate capital. Soon after, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. After 4 years of brutal conflict, the Civil War was effectively over. For many across the North, this was a moment of triumph. Celebrations broke out in cities and towns, but Lincoln did not see it as a victory to boast about. He saw it as the end of a tragedy, one that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives. A vision of healing even before the war officially ended, Lincoln had begun planning for the future. His focus was not punishment, but reconciliation. He believed that the country could only move forward if it healed together. In his second inaugural address in March 1865, Lincoln delivered one of the most powerful speeches in American history. Rather than blaming the South, he spoke of shared responsibility and the need for compassion. His words reflected both humility and hope. With malice toward none, with charity for all, these were not just words, they were a blueprint for rebuilding a broken nation. Lincoln wanted the Southern states to return to the Union quickly and peacefully. He proposed lenient policies, encouraging forgiveness rather than revenge. This approach was controversial. Many in the North demanded harsher punishment for those who had rebelled. But Lincoln remained firm in his belief that unity required understanding, not bitterness. A personal moment of peace for the first time in years, Lincoln allowed himself a brief moment of relief. The war was ending, the Union was preserved, slavery had been struck down. He spent time with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, speaking about the future. They discussed travel, quieter days, and life beyond the presidency. For a man who had carried the weight of a nation, these thoughts were rare and deeply human. Friends and observers noticed a change in him. Though still marked by the hardships of war, there was a lightness in his spirit, a sense that the burden he had carried for so long was finally lifting. But history, often cruel in its timing, had one final tragedy waiting. The night at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, just days after the war's end, Lincoln decided to attend a play at Ford's Theater. It was meant to be a simple evening of relaxation, a brief escape from the responsibilities that had defined his life. The play was Our American Cousin, a popular comedy. The audience was cheerful, the mood light. No one could have imagined what was about to happen. Among those in the theater that night was John Wilkes Booth, a well-known actor and Confederate sympathizer. Driven by anger and resentment over the South's defeat, Booth had planned a terrible act. During the performance, he quietly entered the presidential box. In a single shocking moment, he fired a pistol at Lincoln from behind. The sound echoed through the theater, followed by confusion and panic. Booth leapt onto the stage and escaped, shouting defiance as he fled. Lincoln was carried across the street to a nearby house, where doctors worked desperately to save him. Through the long night, his condition remained critical. Members of his cabinet, friends, and family gathered, watching and waiting. The final goodbye on the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln passed away. The news spread quickly across the nation. Shock turned into grief. Cities fell silent. People wept openly in the streets. The man who had guided the country through its darkest chapter was gone, just as peace had finally arrived. His death was not just the loss of a president, but the loss of a symbol, a leader who had come to represent unity, justice, and humanity. A nation in mourning Lincoln's funeral became a national event. His body was transported by train across several states, allowing millions of Americans to pay their respects. Crowds gathered along the tracks, standing in silence as the train passed. For many, Lincoln had become more than a political figure. He was a fatherly presence, a steady voice during chaos, and a reminder that leadership could be both strong and compassionate. Even in the South, where he had once been viewed as an enemy, attitudes began to shift. Over time, many came to recognize the fairness and restraint he had shown, even in victory. A legacy that endures today, Abraham Lincoln is remembered as one of the greatest leaders in history. His journey from a humble log cabin to the presidency remains one of the most inspiring stories of perseverance and character. He preserved the Union at its most fragile moment. He took decisive steps to end slavery. And perhaps most importantly, he showed that leadership is not about power alone, but about empathy, integrity, and moral courage. His words continue to echo across generations. His decisions continue to shape the world, and his example continues to inspire those who seek to lead with both strength and compassion. The final reflection Lincoln once said, "I am not bound to win, but I am bound to be true." In the end, that truth defined his life. He did not seek greatness for its own sake. He did not claim perfection, but he remained true to his values, to his country, and to his belief that all people deserve dignity and freedom. From the quiet log cabin of his birth to the grand halls of the White House, his journey was not easy, nor was it perfect, but it was meaningful. And that is why his story endures, not just as history, but as a reminder of what one determined, thoughtful, and compassionate human being can achieve.